Welcome to Engaging Kitsap, a positive local forum where we bring engaging people, ideas, and organizations into our BCAT studio. Today we welcome Dr. Naomi Levine, Community Liaison with the Kitsap Public Health District, who works on opioid prevention and response as part of the Chronic Disease and Injury Prevention team. She's going to introduce us to a new inspiring campaign to prevent opioid overdoses called Tough Love, with the word tough crossed out. Welcome, Naomi. Share why this work is needed here in Kitsap County.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me, Colleen. So this campaign was designed to promote interpersonal communication between adults about substance use. And we focus on that adult-to-adult communication because in Kitsap County, between the years 2020 and 2024, the data shows that people who experienced a fatal overdose from opioids, went to the emergency department for an opioid overdose, or were responded to by our local EMS for a suspected opioid overdose, were most commonly age 25 and older. We're focusing on that adult population and also keeping in mind that absolutely naloxone is still something that's essential to keep as part of our first aid kit and make sure that we know how to use it for when that opioid overdose does occur. But we also want to make sure that we're taking that step back and seeing how can we prevent the overdose from happening in the first case. Making sure that we prevent that trauma from someone. And so generally what this campaign then is promoting is for someone like myself, not as public health professional, Naomi, but as a community member, as a loved one, as a friend, and as a colleague, to make sure that I'm engaging in those open, non-judgmental, and non-punitive conversations with folks when they open up to me about their substance use.
Yes. Well, so this new campaign is public-facing, but you've been doing this work in the community with partners for some time now, with healthcare, government, first responders. Tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. So this campaign's part of that larger community-wide effort to reduce social isolation and loneliness. That follows our conversation that happened at the Strengthening Our Connections Forum in the summer of 2024, where folks really got an understanding of kind of what is the state of social isolation and loneliness here in Kitsap County. And with that in mind, and then thinking through different types of campaigns that we could have, when we found this one, it felt like that kind of perfect fit because it not only spoke to promoting social connection, but it allowed us to, here at Kitsap Public Health District, thinking from that lens that I focus on of opioid prevention and response, fall back on what is a really common sentiment in recovery and treatment spaces, which is that the opposite of addiction is connection. And so promoting that connection with this campaign is absolutely essential for that. And this messaging then, in addition to then promoting that social connection and that non-judgmental communication to reduce stigma, is also there to promote folks thinking about how to engage in behavior safer, making sure that we're being mindful about how we prevent overdoses from happening, and being mindful of those additional community resources that we're aware of out in this space. And so with all of that and being able to say a big yes and to this big community narrative around trying to promote social connection, at Kitsap Public Health District, we did a lot of research and looked at the peer-reviewed literature out there, as well as talking with folks with lived and living experience about the campaign and about stigma. And what we heard was that stigma is a huge barrier to people talking to one another and seeking help. And that it was really essential that we fostered that social connection so that people could, when they wanted help or just wanted someone to talk to, felt like they could reach out.
Yes. Well, explain a little bit about how judgment, punishment, stigma might affect someone who's dealing with substance use disorder and why those things are being singled out in this campaign.
Absolutely. Punishment, judgment, and stigma create that barrier to communication and further deepen social isolation. And so when we're thinking about, like, if you wanted to approach somebody to have a conversation with them about a particularly tricky topic, and you have either this perception of or past experience with bringing up a kind of difficult topic, and what you've gotten in response are those things, is that punishment, judgment, and stigma, it's going to create that barrier to wanting to initiate that conversation again, because we don't want to experience those things. And unfortunately, talking to people is still one of the best ways to find things out and learn new information and seek help.
Yeah.
And so if we can't have that conversation, then it's really hard to get that help from one another. And so what we're hoping with this campaign and with this kind of conversation is that when we're thinking about reducing those things, what we're doing is we're suggesting that we're bringing people in the capacities that we can, right? And bringing someone in is going to look different depending on the relationship that you have with them. But the reduction in isolation can still be the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the Tough Love campaign operates on the premise that connection is overdose prevention, right? And invites us all to get connected or stay connected. So when we're thinking about connection, what does that mean? And why is connection so important for our well-being, for all of us?
Yeah. So
Okay.
when we talk about connection and social isolation and loneliness, it's good to think back on the report titled Our Epidemic of Isolation and Loneliness, which was written by the former Surgeon General and their staff in 2023. And in that report are three vital components of social connection. We have structure, function, and quality. So structure is that sort of quantity and variety of types of relationships that we have, as well as our frequency of interactions. Function then is how much we rely on others to meet our needs.
Okay.
And then quality is how positive, helpful, or satisfying our relationships are. And so when we think about all of these things in the context of the campaign, it's really important to acknowledge that we cannot be everything to someone, right, in all of these different areas, but we can be a little bit more intentional about which types of connections we can be for different people.
Okay. Can you give us an example of maybe different kinds of connection that we might have with different individuals in our lives?
Absolutely. So when we think about the different types of connections that we can have in our life, I sort of think about my own experience with it of, I can be a positive interaction to a whole lot of different people without needing to be that person who they rely on to take them to the airport or somebody who they even talk to on a regular basis.
Sure.
Right. But I can still have that friendly conversation with them. And I will self-admit as the person who will talk to you about the weather if you're down in Quincy Square, or if you're just walking around.
Right.
I fully enjoy that. I'm also someone who regularly shops at Winco and will pick the same cashier on a regular basis because I just enjoy that kind of consistent positive interaction
Yeah.
with someone who I kind of know. And both of these kinds of relationships may not be the ones where someone wants to talk to me about their substance use. But whenever I think about it in the context of talking to someone about their substance use, I can think about those types of connections, right? Like what is the structure of our relationship, the function, and the quality. And being somebody who has a lot of those kinds of relationships is really new to me. It's something that I did intentionally in my life because I felt like I was lacking in those social connections and was really feeling some of the effects of that isolation and loneliness. And so this became really important to me to make sure that I involved that more for me. And I think that that's something that when we think about it then in the context of the campaign with substance use, that we're thinking about, right, how can we show up for someone? Can you be that positive interaction out on the sidewalk when you're talking to someone, waiting for the light to change? Or in those more in-depth long-term relationships, am I someone who's making sure that I'm checking in on someone? Making sure that I give them that call, right?
Well, I think what I'm hearing you say is that sometimes making connections with people takes a little practice and a little intention, right?
Absolutely.
Even if they're little things like talking to the cashier.
Yeah.
I really like that. I think what's beautiful about this campaign is that it does encourage us to have these one-on-one communications with people. And I like that on the website, you have a conversation guide that provides advice about having conversations around health in general, not just specifically substance use or even opioid use, but just difficult conversations that we might need to have on a day-to-day basis. Can you give us an example of a difficult conversation that we might need to have and how having conversations could prevent an overdose?
Yeah. So one example that I've heard out in the community, as well as his experience with my own family, is concerns around somebody who has chronic pain and has been prescribed an opioid to manage that pain. And then some changes in their life occurred that poses a bit of a concern. and trying to figure out how do you approach that person to talk about how
Yeah,
that might be a bit of an impact we might need to navigate with their doctor. Right? And that's a really tricky conversation to have because there's a lot of different factors
sure.
going on there. And so that's where I think that, right, going back to that conversation guide that you brought up on our website is a really fantastic place to start. Making sure that you're sitting down with that person. First step is you engage in that active listening. That's where we're listening to what they're saying, starting with a kind of open prompting question, not interrupting them when they're talking, making sure that we paraphrase back what we're hearing to check that we're understanding. And that can also be really helpful for making sure that we're not judging what they're saying.
Yeah,
Yeah. Second is making sure that we're practicing empathy by acknowledging the emotions that are happening in that, acknowledging how they're feeling and how they're coming to this space. And then following that with making sure that you're asking non-judgmental and open-ended questions, right? Giving them the space to kind of define what's going on by keeping the questions as open as possible and trying to keep as much of that bias that we have out of it. The next bit of advice that we have on there, and this can be if they're open to it, you
right.
might be able to offer them some advice or suggestions on resources, several of which we have on the campaign page, and some that folks in the community might know from their other experiences out throughout Kitsap County, of course. And then finally, if it feels relevant to the conversation and if you yourself feel comfortable doing so, you can share your own experience, right? If it's a conversation with a loved one about a prescription medication and wanting to talk with their doctor and you have an experience with that, being open to sharing that with them, and how it might have seemed scary, but it was a really important conversation to have. And all of this, right, it seems like, right, we've laid out a pretty easy conversation there, but it's going to feel really difficult.
Right, yeah.
I mean, I know I've been through these conversations, and what can feel really challenging about it is that mentally, I need to remind myself to slow down, right? There's a whole lot of fear that's showing up as I'm concerned about the person that I'm talking to. Some of the things that they're saying might be really scary for
Yeah,
me. And so making sure that I slow down and I stay present with them, for the duration of that conversation. And this might be multiple conversations. And kind of finally making sure that we acknowledge that when we go into those conversations, that a conversation does not always mean that it's going to lead to change or that change even needs to occur, right?
right.
We're going in open for that conversation.
That makes sense. So the words that we use when we're talking about substance use are really important. And we may not realize if we're coming across as being judgmental or that we're labeling someone. Can you share some tips for how we might examine our own way of speaking about this so that we can show up and be more compassionate to someone when we're having this kind of conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So one that's come up quite a bit is around person first language. And what that essentially means is that whenever we talk about, like, for the example, substance use, rather than calling them a drug user or a druggie, we would say it's someone that I know who's using drugs, right? Insert name who's using drugs
Right.
of the person that you're talking about. And that might seem just like semantics or wordsmithing that might seem very unimportant and kind of surface level. But what's really important is that the way that we use language and the way that we describe people um, is really important for how we develop our own self-concept, as well as how we develop our understanding of the identity of others. And when we think about substance use, that is one behavior that a person has in a whole day, week, month,
Sure.
year of
Yeah.
things that they engage in. And when we label somebody and we reduce them down to just that one behavior, we no longer acknowledge them as a whole and complex person. And we set up a set of really small set of expectations that we have of them rather than being there for helping them flourish, right? As a whole person, being able to embrace them as more than just one thing.
If I know somebody who is becoming more isolated,
Mm.
or maybe I know that they're using a substance for whatever reason, what's the most important thing that I can do to show that I have concern and support for that person?
Take a risk and have a conversation, right? Open it up, open up that line of dialogue. And then, referring back on the campaign advice that we have on our website, making sure that you are aware of resources in case if that does come up in conversation, or at least know how to navigate to the website to show it to them. always have naloxone on hand. That should be part of basic first aid so that you're prepared in case if an overdose does occur,
Okay.
that you're able to save a life, and making sure that you're there with them. You stay present as much as you possibly can be.
Nice. Thank you. And you do have some really great resources on your website for the Tough Love campaign. And I just want to say thank you so much, Naomi, for your heartfelt and impactful work, but also bringing the Tough Love campaign to our BCAT viewers.
Thank you.
Great having you.
Yeah.
You've been watching Engaging Kitsap, a positive local forum where we bring engaging people, ideas, and organizations into the BCAT studio. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.